Hey guys, today we're going to be covering day 3 of putting it all together, where we're going to be covering economic indicators like GDP, inflation, a little bit of unemployment. We've already talked about unemployment earlier when we talked about, the Phillips curve, and then we're also going to talk about the business cycle. So let's start off first with the business cycle. My screen, there we go. That's a little bit better. Move my camera up a little bit more. All right, let's get going. So you might have some space. The business cycle doesn't take a lot of room. So if you have space still where we talked about the circular flow model, that didn't take up a whole page. So you could probably put the business cycle at the bottom of the circular flow model page. And it's fine because those two graphs are pretty similar in a way that they don't really change. They're just visual representations of a bigger story. So we'll talk about the business cycle. Okay, so I am aware that in my last video, but we talked about cyclical unemployment, and then I misspelled cyclical unemployment. I missed a C. So good job to all the people that pointed that out. I appreciate that. So the business cycle is on a graph, technically. We have GDP over time. And basically the business cycle, what it illustrates is short-run fluctuations. Ooh, I can't write. Fluctuations. Is that how you spell fluctuations? Probably not. Fluctuations? Short-run changes? Man, that's what happens when you have when you went to Decker Prairie. Short-run changes. Nice. Short-run changes in GDP. How GDP goes up, down, falls, peaks, and it looks something like this. So when GDP starts growing over time, that's called a period of expansion. At the very top of each business cycle, there's a peak. That's the highest the GDP has been since the last peak. And where GDP stops growing, but hasn't started to fall just yet. So here's a peak, here's another one, and even here is a period of expansion because GDP going up again. When GDP starts to fall, it's called one of two things. It's either called a contraction, like contractionary, or you can call it a recession. Recession is probably the most common way to call it. And at the very bottom of the business cycle, when GDP stops falling but hasn't started to rise just yet, that's called a trough. So a couple of vocabulary things. When GDP, for it to be considered a recession, GDP has to fall for 2 consecutive quarters in a year. So a quarter of a year is 3 months. So 2 consecutive quarters means 6 months in a row. So if GDP only goes down for a couple months and then goes back up again, that's not considered a recession just yet. So GDP falls for 6 months in a row. Notice how depressions are not in the business cycle. That's because depressions are not cyclical. They do not happen every so often. They're quite rare. In fact, the United States has only had one. So we don't really put it part of the business cycle because they are not cyclical like recessions. Recessions happen about every 20 years. Depressions, on the other hand, not in the business cycle, but is when GDP goes down for 2 years in a row. Or 8 quarters. But if you look back at our business cycle, you see that there are shortened fluctuations, but over the long run, the economy grows. And that's true. The line of fit is upward sloping. So the economy grows over time, but has short run fluctuations. And that's a natural thing. So that's the business cycle. A couple things just of what happens in each of these little sections. So in a period of expansion, there's more spending, prices are going up, unemployment is going down, but in a period of recession, it's just the other one, just the opposite. Prices are falling, and unemployment is going up. So that's the big two things that you need to remember. Not only is GDP going up and down, but prices and unemployment are also changing in those times. All right, so that's the business cycle. Now we are going to a new page where we're talking about GDP, gross domestic product. Remember, gross domestic product, what it is the final goods and final market value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given period of time. So it's the final, I'll say the final market value. Yeah, that's fine. Of goods and services, of all goods and services. Produced in an economy, produced, I'll say in the borders, because it has to be in that country, otherwise it's like GNP maybe. In the borders of a country in a given period of time. Okay, so let's kind of break down what each of these things mean. Okay, final means no intermediary goods. So it has to be reaching the customer. So if it isn't like an input, so let's say that I build houses and so I work in construction and I buy lumber. Well, I'm not the customer. I am just an intermediary producer. I'm building a house. The house is going to a customer. So what I pay for in lumber is not added in GDP. It's when it finally gets to the customer, whoever is the last stop in that purchasing of the product, that is when it counts towards GDP. So only final goods and services, no input prices, no intermediary goods. Only the final product is calculated towards GDP because the price of that house is going to include the price of the lumber. So I don't need to count it twice. If you do, that's called double counting. So double counting is when you have final goods and services, but then you also include intermediary goods and services like input prices and resources. And that is not needed because that'd be counting like everything twice. So that's why it's called double count. So that's why we only do final goods and services. Not only does it save us time, but it includes all those other steps. So we don't really need to add them. Market value means like dollar price. Like, GDP is measured in dollars. So it's the final price, like the sticker price of all final goods and services produced in the borders of a country. It doesn't matter who is doing the production, but it has to be in the borders of the country for it to count towards like America's GDP. So even if it's a non-American product, let's say a Honda dealership in the United States, that is going to count towards America's GDP because, well, it's in the United States. In a given period of time, GDP is calculated usually annually, so for the year, or it could be measured like quarterly. So they would compare maybe the first quarter of 2019 to the first quarter of 2020 to see how compared, to where we were this time last year, how are we doing? Or they'll do the entire year of 2019 versus 2020 and measure growth that way. So that's the definition of GDP. Let's talk about the things that are counted towards GDP and the things that are not counted towards GDP. So counted versus not counted. So counted in GDP, well, all the variables that make up GDP. So there's two different ways that we can measure GDP. Of adding up everyone's spending or everyone's income. So there's two approaches towards measuring GDP. The expenditure approach. You guys know this probably the best. It is consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. Remember, this is all of everyone's spending. I buy, businesses buy, governments buy, and foreigners buy, and it has to be spending in the United States. That's one way that you can measure GDP. There's also the income approach. There's an A in there somewhere. There we go. The income approach is adding up everyone's incomes. So remember, not only can you add up spending, but you can also add up everyone's income. And people earn income in different ways, depending on what type of resource they're selling. A lot of people sell, how they make income is they sell their labor, and they're going to earn a wage. Some people sell own land and they sell it and they earn a rent. Maybe you're the owner of like lots of capital, lots of machinery, and you rent it out and you might charge interest. That's how you make money. Or maybe you're an entrepreneur and you sell your ideas, you sell your innovation, and hopefully you make a profit. So W plus R plus I plus P is the income approach of GDP. Rent plus wages plus interest plus profit is going to be the income approach. You can add up either of these two variables, RWIP or whatever this is, WORP, plus or CIGXN, and you're going to get the same number, GDP. So it counts all of that. You can also measure it per capita. So like GDP per capita is just you take the country's GDP and you divide by the population, and you're going to get GDP per capita. So while the United States has the largest GDP in the world, we do not have the largest GDP per capita because our population is quite large. So like Canada, they have a larger GDP per capita than the United States because of the population size. Things that are not included in GDP. Well, used products. Used products are now counted towards GDP because, well, they were counted when they were new, but we're not going to keep counting the same products over and over again. They only get counted once when they were new. What's also not counted is like black market activities. Those are goods and services being exchanged, but they're not being reported. Non-market activities, these are not illegal, but maybe you like babysit for a neighbor, or maybe you mow their yard or something, and goods and services are being exchanged for money, but you're not reporting it to the IRS or anything. So it's services being exchanged, not illegal. That would be more like black market, but just more cash business, things like that. If you're a waitress or a waiter or something, you should report your tips, but if you don't, well, that's like a non-market activity. Of course, actually, I think that might be illegal. So used products, black market, non-market activities. The quality of life is not measured. Just because you're the richest country in the world does not make it the best place to live. You could have lots of maybe violence or maybe inequality in the law, or not the highest literacy rate, high infant death mortality, things like that. That you would think you would be able to solve those problems with a high GDP, but not necessarily. Okay, that's all I can think of right now. Maybe more will come to me. Of counted versus not counted used products. I always tend to forget that one, so that's good that I remembered. All right, let's talk about GDP versus GNP. Okay, so if we're talking, this is like in the United States, in USA. So in the United States, all products being produced, no matter who you are, is GDP. GNP is all about your nationality. It doesn't matter where you are, but all Americans anywhere. So a Ford factory in Mexico would count towards our America's gross national product because it's American. But since it's in Mexico, it would count towards Mexico's GDP because it's in the borders of Mexico. So GDP is all about the borders of a country, while GNP is all about the nationality. What they share in common is Americans, for the United States specifically, Americans in the borders of America. And that's actually called a different thing. It's called NNP, for net national product. That's what they have in common. It's just what is being produced by Americans in the United States. So Americans in the United States, American individuals, American businesses in USA. What GDP also includes is not just Americans in the United States, but anyone, foreigners in the United States. So GDP is basically anybody, whether they're foreigners, they're Americans, they are in the United States. That's what they have in common. While GNP doesn't matter where you are, it matters who you are. So not just Americans in the United States, but Americans in other countries. American companies or American individuals. What these have in common is the fact they're American. So American, just in general, is going to be gross national product. People in the borders of the United States, it's going to be GDP, but what they have in common is the net national product, the NNP. For GDP, we have to kind of mention, this kind of is going to bleed into the idea of inflation, which we'll get to on the next page. But let's talk about real versus nominal GDP specifically. So it's kind of combining inflation and gross domestic product into this idea of real versus nominal GDP. Okay, so real GDP is adjusted for inflation. And that doesn't go just for GDP, that goes for any real value is adjusted for inflation, while nominal is not adjusted for inflation. A synonym of nominal is current, like current GDP, while real, a synonym for that would be constant GDP. And what's being held as current or constant is the purchasing power, is the price. So if we hold prices of everything the same forever and just measure everything that's been bought and sold, then that's going to be real GDP. We've adjusted for inflation. We pretend that there hasn't been any inflation. We're going to keep all prices the same for the last, let's say, 50 years. And we're just going to measure, well, how much money would we have made just by selling more quantity, not because the prices have gone up, but because we are actually selling more. And so that's why it's constant, because we're assuming that prices, let's just pretend prices have remained constant this whole time. While nominal is not adjusted for inflation because it's using the current price of the time. So it's not adjusted for inflation because it is having the different current prices throughout time and making comparisons that way. It's kind of hard to say which one's real growth or what's just the, it's a higher number because prices have gone up, or is it a higher number because we've kept prices the same, we're selling more. So if we're keeping prices the same and selling more, that's adjusted for inflation. But if we're just saying, hey, we sold more and we rose prices, look how much more money we made, well, that's not adjusted for inflation. So those are the two different definitions, but let's get to some equations. So usually you're going to be solving for real GDP, but it is nominal GDP divided by either, you can use the CPI or you can use the GDP deflator. Technically, it's going to be this, I'm not writing correctly. It's going to be the same number. It's going to be a number around 100. And you multiply all that by 100 and you're going to solve for real GDP. I'm trying to think if there's anything else of GDP that I want to say before I move on to inflation. I'm going to pause it really, really quick. I'm going to quickly look at my notes just to make sure that I haven't missed anything, and then I'll come back. Okay, we're back, and I did not miss anything, so we're moving right along. Now we're going to talk about inflation. So you can, if you have room on this page, you can add to this page, or if you wanted to, you can start on a new page, inflation. We're not going to talk about everything inflation right now because there will be a page where we have every single equation that we're going to use for the class, like every equation from fiscal policy to monetary policy to calculating unemployment and inflation. So the equations, except for the one that I just showed you, we'll throw that on in the other page as well, but we're going to have basically more definitions here. So inflation is the rise in prices over time. So remember, when there's inflation, which means higher prices, it makes your purchasing power fall. So the result of inflation is your purchasing power, the power of each dollar falls. because your dollar's buying less if prices are higher. I used to be able to buy a whole hamburger for $1. Now I need $2. So each dollar is less powerful when prices go up. Of course, if there's deflation, the result of deflation is a higher purchasing power. Your purchasing power increases. Okay, so what are some of the causes of inflation? There's 3 big causes of inflation. The one that most people are most familiar with is the quantity theory. The quantity theory is just when there's too much money supplied available in the economy. There's just too much money in the economy. Maybe they print too much or they have too much of an easy monetary policy. There's just too much money in the economy. So basically, there's more money in the economy than there are goods and services available in the economy. So there's a lot of money all searching for the same products. And when businesses see that there's a whole bunch of customers with money and they only have maybe one product, what are they going to do? They're going to raise their prices because they can't satisfy everybody. And they also want to make some money, and they're like, look how much money everybody has. Everybody has all this money, so let me raise my prices. And when everybody does that, that creates inflation. There's the other 2 you guys are more familiar with, demand pull. Demand pull inflation, which just means there's too much aggregate demand. There's too much demand. There's too much spending. And maybe there's like the right amount of money, but because of all the spending, once again, businesses look around and think about our aggregate supply and demand graph. When aggregate demand shifts to the right, prices go up. And the last one is cost push inflation. It's also called stagflation. But this is when there's too little supply. Instead of too much aggregate demand, there's too little short run aggregate supply. And the reason for that is typically because of higher input prices. Higher input prices, that's why it's called cost push. It costs more to produce with higher input prices. And so those higher input prices push up the cost and makes higher prices for everything. So those are the 3 causes. These are not the definitions of inflation. These are the causes of inflation: quantity theory, demand pull, and cost push inflation. So let's talk about who was hurt and who was helped by inflation. Who is hurt versus who is helped by inflation. Okay, so basically, whenever there's inflation, you need to think of my purchasing power has gone down. The purchasing power of each dollar has decreased. So that really stinks if you're being paid money with lower purchasing power. So maybe you live on a fixed income. You only get $600 a month for groceries, for Social Security, or maybe your retirement account, pension, something like that, welfare. And if prices go up, well, it's not like my paycheck goes up. And so now, because each dollar buys less, I'm hurt by this. So anyone that's either being paid or receiving money in some way, maybe they live off a fixed income. If you are being paid any money, you are going to be hurt by this because you're being paid with lower purchasing power, money that's worth less. And so that's going to hurt. But if you are paying, if you are on the sending end, so if you're receiving money, that hurts. But if you are having to pay money that's worthless, that's not a big deal at all. And so if you are paying money, then you're going to be helped by this because there's less purchasing power. You don't mind. So some examples of that, if you were having to pay back a loan, your pay back a loan, after inflation, that inflation actually helped because now you have to pay back less in terms of purchasing power than what you borrowed in the first place. Unfortunately, that hurts the banks. They are being paid money back from you because you borrowed it from them. So banks are typically the ones that are hurt because they are loaning out. So are you giving the loan? Then you are hurt by inflation. But if you're having to pay back a loan, if you're getting a loan and then paying it back, inflation actually benefits you because you don't have to pay back as much purchasing power. Of course, the banks know this and they're in the business to make money. So how they don't end up on the hurt side is that they charge higher in interest than what they think the inflation is going to eat away. So inflation, actually, I'll put this on the same page. Inflation is a monster. It eats away at everything. It eats away at your savings account. It eats away at your paycheck. It eats away at a lot of stuff. And so banks, they know that whatever I charge in terms of interest, inflation is going to eat away from that. And I'll be left with whatever's left over. And so banks know that, so they charge higher than what they believe inflation to be. And that's called the Fisher equation. That's what that's how they protect themselves. We'll write this again on our equation sheet, but I do want to put this here so this is how banks prevent themselves from being in that hurt column when it comes to inflation. If they charge, let's do nominal interest rate minus expected inflation is equal to, I know I ran out of room. Real interest rate. So banks will charge the nominal interest rate based on whatever they expect inflation to be. They know whatever they charge, inflation is going to eat away from it. That's why it's a minus sign. It's going to subtract. It's going to take away whatever they charge, and they'll be left with whatever's left. So if I expect inflation to be average around 2% a year, that's usually what it is. Let's say I want to get a 5% return at the end, like I want to make 5% interest off of each loan that I give. Well, I better charge 7%. So banks will charge 7 because they know inflation is going to eat away around 2% a year, and then they'll be left with 5%, and that was their real return on that loan. So they're going to end up on the winning column. If they don't charge any interest, then the inflation is just going to eat away. That's why they charge interest, to protect themselves so they don't end up in the hurt column of who is hurt and who is helped by inflation. Remember, inflation is on the y-axis of the Phillips curve. It's kind of also on the y-axis in terms of price level on aggregate supply and demand, which means if something's on the y-axis of a graph, it cannot shift the graph. So a change of price level or inflation cannot shift aggregate supply or demand, and it cannot shift the Phillips curve or do anything like that, because whatever the y-axis is cannot possibly shift the graph because it is like an independent variable. It is not a separate shifting variable. I do want to talk about, I want to make sure inflation, Ooh, CPI. I totally forgot about the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a basket. It's technically a list. It's not a physical basket. A basket of items whose prices are watched by the government, whose prices are watched and measured, whose prices are watched and measured to measure inflation. Here's the thing about the CPI. It doesn't include everything. It only includes like 8,000 items. I know that sounds like a lot, but there's a lot more items not on that list. And so the U.S. government will measure the price of those things to make sure that a couple things have and haven't happened. They make sure that if the price stays the same, that the quality of that product has gone down. So let's say like toilet paper. Let's say it's $5 one year, and the next year it's $5. But what if it goes down from 2-ply to 1-ply? technically the price went up because the quality of it went down and the price stayed the same. So you're paying the same for less. So technically the price went up. And they sometimes every few years they will change what's on the list based on the different tastes of people. The CD player used to be on the consumer price index, but now maybe a new phone. They used to measure the price of I'm trying to think. There'll be things like on a gallon of gas, a gallon of milk, price of a new pair of jeans, things like that. Common everyday items, but some things will be tweaked. They're not going to have a typewriter on there anymore. They're going to have like a computer or a laptop. And that's what the CPI measures. We'll talk about how changes of CPI measures inflation when we do all of the equations on that one page. But when it comes to what's it called? Inflation, I think we are good. I do want to talk about unemployment just a little tiny bit. Maybe if you have some space on your Phillips curve page, since we talked about the 4 types of unemployment the other day, you can add this to it. Or if you want to do it here, that's fine too. So remember, to be unemployed, you have no job, but you're looking. If you currently have a job that you don't like and you're also looking for a new job on the side, you're not unemployed. You don't count towards the unemployment rate. So no job, but looking, and you have to be over the age of 16. So if you're 15 and looking, you don't count towards the unemployment level until you are 16 of age. There's also something called a discouraged worker. A discouraged worker is not a worker. I know it sounds like they're a worker, but they have lost hope. They are no longer looking for a job. Because the job market is so bad that they've given up hope. They've given up hope. And so it looks like, oh, well, if they've given up hope, like that's really bad. Like the economy is so bad. But here's the thing: if they are they're no longer looking for a job, they're no longer considered unemployed, which means they no longer count for the unemployment rate. So sometimes the economy can get so bad for so long that the unemployment numbers drop, not because people are getting jobs, but because people are losing hope and then going from an unemployed person to a discouraged worker. And so they no longer count towards the labor force. Because the labor force includes the number of employed plus the number of unemployed. And if you're a discouraged worker, you're not unemployed anymore. You're part of the population, but you're not part of the labor force. And since we're here, I might as well do the equations for the labor force. The unemployment rate, unemployment percentage, is the number of unemployed over the labor force times 100. That'll give you the percentage of unemployment. Remember, that natural rate of unemployment is not 0%, but that 4 to 6% unemployment. And then there's also the labor force participation rate. A labor force participation rate is basically saying what percentage of the population is in the labor force. And so it's the number of the labor force divided by the population times 100. That's the labor force participation rate. And one last idea of unemployment before we are done for the day is Okun's Law. I can scroll down. Is that it? Okay. I can't see my whatever. Okay. Okun's Law. Hello? Can I not do this? Am I done? Okay. Well, it's not letting me say my one last thing that I needed to say. So I'll just tell you. Okun's Law, O-K-U-N''S. Okun's Law says that for every 1% that the unemployment rate goes above the natural rate, so not between like 4 to 6, but let's say 1% from 6% to 7%. So for every 1% that unemployment goes above the natural rate, GDP will actually fall by 2%. So there is a 1 to 2% ratio between unemployment and GDP, and it's a negative relationship. Unemployment goes up 1%, GDP falls by 2, and vice versa. When unemployment falls by 1%, GDP will go up by 2. So that is Okun's law. It just shows the relationship between unemployment and the GDP rate and the ratio between those two variables, which is a negative relationship. And I think I'm done for today because my board decided to quit. And that's fine because it's getting close to closing time. I will see you guys later for another day of putting it all together. Bye, guys.